I'll wait for everyone to jump on. And in the meantime, let me know if you can hear me okay. Let me know if the sound is coming through and the video is coming through. Hello, hello. Thanks for joining. I can see people are jumping on. So just leave me a few comments here. Audio coming through. Bob Knight says loud and clear. Fantastic on Periscope. Just wait for a few other comments from the other channels. So this is the book that we're covering. In the meantime, as people jump on, Is This a Dream? We're on the chapter on meditation. So this is the 3 stages of meditation. We're going to read a little bit from page 34 today. All right. Jennifer says good on Facebook. Great. Patty, Sumi, great. Sandy from Arizona, good to see you. If you do have the book, by the way, please do leave a review on Amazon for Is This a Dream? It is available on Amazon. And we will go ahead and get started. So as people continue to jump on, let's begin with a meditation. So relax, be as you are. Take some easy and full breaths. Let your entire being relax from head to toe, side to side. Note the space that we are all sharing. The space we're all inhabiting, which also includes this interpretation of physicality. We'll let the mind relax and open. The reflections we'll be talking about today are subtle reflections, which requires an open mind as well as a thinking mind. Here in this space, we balance openness, thinking, feeling, and sensing. So take this moment to sense the boundaries of the body, to sense what the personality is like. and to consider that what we sense as a body, a personality, and other bodies, personalities, and places even, are representations of a deeper consciousness, which is perfectly consistent with reason and science. So now, as we open our eyes, the world populates. Doesn't mean there wasn't a world before we opened our eyes. It just means that what we recognized of this world was one kind of interpretation, one kind of experience. As eyes open, what we recognize of this world is another kind of experience, another kind of interpretation. So the opening and closing of the eyes, of the eyelids specifically, although we think about it as when we close the eyelids, we stop seeing the world that is there, that is still existing behind the eyelids. On the other side of the eyelids, another way to interpret the exact same experience is that the movement of the eyelids, either opened or closed, are themselves representations of a process of seeing and not seeing. Right? The interpretive process includes the movement of the eyelids. So, what we'll do as we get to today's questions, I'm starting with this because one of the questions last week, by the way, thank you all, those who've joined in between. This is the book that we are discussing. Is this a dream? And now, let's get to the questions. So, last week, somebody said, is what you're saying about the moon and perception scientifically proven? All right, so last week we talked about, you can go back and check last week's episode, but we talked about Einstein's comment. I don't remember it exactly. I'm paraphrasing. He said something like, do you mean to say that if I don't look at the moon, that the moon doesn't exist? Right? That sounds kind of silly. And so we talked about that last week. And what I suggested at the time is that what we call a moon is only an aspect or a particular band of what the moon is. This is the whole point. It is not that when Anoop sees the moon, or you see the moon, or somebody else sees a moon through a telescope, it is not that we are seeing the entirety of what we call moon, right? To make the obvious point, we're only seeing one face of the moon. There's obviously another face that we can't see from this angle, right? Nobody has ever seen the entire moon. All we have is snapshots from infinite angles, infinite snapshots from which we reason that there is a singular moon, a single moon there, right? So what we are getting each time we see the moon is we are receiving an interpretation of light. Interpreted light is what we see as the image of the moon. What we call the moon is the reasoning which says that multiple snapshots of interpreted light, when put together, mean that there is an independent rock there called the moon. It's an interpretation, a conceptual reasoning is what we refer to as moon. If we actually look at the experience, it's actually a series of snapshots, a series of interpretations of reflected light. So the question is, what is it that is there, that is existing, which is then interpreted as this moon? And of course, some people say, well, it's the rock, but even that rock Even if you touch it, it's an interpretation through the electrical signals that go through the hand, right? The texture, the sight of it, the smell of it, if somebody actually tasted a moon rock, the taste of it, any sense perception is an interpretation of reflected signals. It is not a direct perception of what is. And so from that standpoint, it is not that the moon, the entirety of what we call the moon is not there. It is yet simply this interpreted version is not there. The idea that the interpreted version is actually an independent existing perception is not there, is what I'm suggesting. Now the question is this scientifically proven? So a couple things about that is that science is based on what we can perceive, and ultimately from that base of what we can perceive, what we can reason based on what we can perceive. So on one hand, what we are perceiving, science is generally conducted, and daily life in our society is generally conducted, and the storytelling in our society is generally conducted from a first mind perspective, right? What does that mean? It means that it's conducted from a subject-object split, where the individual human being, the individual brain is perceiving an external world. There's an assumption of difference and split there. Whereas from a second mind perspective, there is no such assumption. The second mind perception is that there is a fundamental, let's say, non-material substance which differentiates as both the observer and the observed. Now, is this proven by science? It's not proven. However, there are interpretations of quantum physics that suggest this, right? Relational interpretations in which the observer and the observed co-arise from a vacuum, right? It's a different terminology. It's arrived at through different means, through mathematics. However, the fundamental principle is the same. There is an undifferentiated layer of reality, which then crops up as the observer and the observed. So there is science that is consistent with this. It's not the same as saying the science proves this. And certainly the terminology is not agreed on. After all, what is the mind to begin with? If we are going to say that this vacuum or this undifferentiated nature of reality is mind, that is not something that science can say one way or the other. That is something that we have to decide on what is mind based on our own experience, right? We come up with definitions and then we can test those definitions. But coming up with the definition of mind naturally begins with our own experience. How do we experience mind? Do we separate mind and body? Do we separate mind and consciousness? Do we distinguish different layers of the mind? All this is based on experience and then subsequently coming up with a definition, and then science comes in to test how that definition operates in the majority of experience. All right, so these are the subtler interpretations of perception. I want to read you something I saw on the NASA website. This is about Copernicus and Galileo and the sun, whether the sun revolves around the earth or the earth revolves around the sun. Just a few sentences. This is from nasa.gov. In 1515, a Polish priest named Nicholas Copernicus proposed that the earth was a planet like Venus or Saturn, and that all planets circled the sun. The theory gathered few followers, and for a time, some of those who did give credence to the idea faced charges of heresy. But the evidence for a heliocentric solar system gradually mounted. When Galileo pointed his telescope into the night sky in 1610, he saw for the first time in human history that moons orbited Jupiter. Galileo also observed the phases of Venus, and this is the most important sentence. Galileo also observed the phases of Venus, which proved that the planet orbits the sun. Right? So it is initially proposed as a theory by Copernicus that actually the planets circle the sun. But it becomes accepted only much later, once Galileo looks through the telescope and notes that actually it is planets that are revolving around the sun. So what was the difference? The difference was the amount of observation, the observational power through the telescope, and making new observations, seeing new perceptions, and applying that reason. Right? So similarly, are objects independently existing out there as the objects that we see through reasoning? Most certainly not. Right? Quite simply, different nervous systems see, interpret objects differently. So we know that the object that we see, while it looks to be objective, it's simply objective among human beings with a particular nervous system who interpret there to be some external object as a result of the interpretation of reflected light. I know that's a mouthful, right? So the theory comes first. So even with the reasoning, we can say that, well, the world that we see has to be an interpretation. But then what happened later, because of more powerful observation, this is what Galileo represents with his telescope and the many observations he made, he was able to see the many phases of Venus and determine, well, actually, no, planets actually revolve around the sun. So similarly, through a shift in the configuration of the mind, the sensitivity of perception increases, right? Whereby what we see as the eye, what we recognize as the eye, the human eye, the organ of perception which sees external objects, this is recognized as a first mind perspective. The human eye is an organ receiving external stimuli which is interpreted. This kind of split perspective is a first mind configuration perspective. That very same eye, that very same organ, from the perspective of the second mind, is a representation of the process of seeing. The eye itself is a representation. It's the visual representation of the function of sight. And therefore, it is not primarily the eye that sees, it is the mind which sees, and it is the mind which represents itself as the eye as well. Right? A very clear example of this. Think about when you are in a dream, and assuming in that dream, your eyes are looking at a mountain, right? So in the dream you had, let's say last night, you're looking at a mountain. Now your character in the dream that has an eye that is looking at the mountain knows, and I put knows in quotes, knows that their eye is receiving the signal from the mountain and the brain is interpreting it, and therefore they are seeing the mountain through the organ of the eye. But you and I know now, from our level of consciousness, right, recognizing the nature of dreams, you and I know now that that character's eye, which seemed to be undoubtedly an independent organ of perception, itself was a representation of the mind. In fact, the function of sight was being represented as the organ which we call the eye within that dream. And we know, of course, that that mind, after all, it was the mind that was perceiving the mountain. It was not necessarily the eye. After all, the mind which is perceiving, therefore, is not actually limited to that eye in the dream. Right? Within the dream, the character whose eye was receiving the visual stimuli from the dream mountain and is ultimately being perceived by that mind. Within the dream, the character is dependent on the eye because that's the rules of the dream from the first mind configuration. But from now, from our perception, we know that that mind of that character which was seeing that was not actually dependent on those eyes to see. It simply was the rule that was being followed within that first mind configuration. But as happens in lucid dreaming, if that person's awareness shifts to a broader perspective, then they are fully aware that what they may be seeing in the dream is not dependent on the eyes at all. Right? Is not dependent on those dream eyes, because the dream eyes themselves are simply representations of seeing. So similarly, in this waking perspective, in this world right now that we are inhabiting, we all know that we can see without eyes, right? You can close your eyes and you can see many scenes. So what now can be considered is that even as we open these eyes and as the world populates, that even the opening of the eyes itself is seen by the very same mind that sees, let's say, a beach. I'm closing my eyes and I'm visualizing a beach now, right? And I see the beach and I can hear the waves. And now I open my eyes and what populates now, so the beach can still be seen if the attention is on that window, let's say, the beach can still be seen, even in this view, if the attention is there. If the attention is shifted here, then what we see is the screen. Consider that it is the very same mental function that is recognizing this screen, which also includes the function, the medium of the eye, which itself is a sight of this mind. That was a whole mouthful. So if it seems kind of complex or it's like one of those things that doesn't quite click, just simply relax. Because it isn't a conceptual understanding 100%. There's a certain amount that can be recognized conceptually, but it can't fully be recognized conceptually. So in this moment now, become aware of the space behind the thoughts, behind the attempt to understand. Recognize the silence in which thoughts begin to emerge, the silence in which these sounds are emerging. And as the mind rests in this silence, some of the concepts will start falling into place. Right? It's as if it's difficult to string all the concepts together as though they're independent pieces. When the mind relaxes and keeps the space open, each piece will fall into its own groove where it needs to fall. All right. Click the wrong button. And now something else is starting up, so let me click that. So the next question is it possible to reverse time? Okay. We may have talked about time in detail before. Of course, the way we talk about time usually is clock time. We started this at 2 p.m. Eastern time, right? And the day marches forward. What we'll do is just look at one aspect of time today, which is questioning whether time is linear or not. Does time progress from past to present to future? And what do we mean by past, present, and future? So, as a suggestion, consider that what we call the present is simply our interpretation of vividness of experience. All right. So right now, you're seeing the screen, you're seeing this face, hearing these sounds, and these may be the most vivid experience. And if they are, we tend to call it the present, right? If you think back to a memory when you were 5 years old, then that experience may not be as vivid right now as this experience of the screen and the sound would be not the present, right? A less vivid experience could be either past or future. But the moment that experience, whatever it is, becomes very vivid, we start to call it the present. We behave as if it is the present, right? Imagine if we really focused on an event that happened when we were 5 years old. As long as this experience of us on this call is very vivid, that would be called the past. But the moment that experience becomes increasingly vivid, in fact, so vivid that we are now what we call reliving the experience, right? It's like we can see the same room we were in, or we can hear the same sounds. The moment it reaches that level of vividness, the vividness of this experience, us having this conversation, starts to go down. And now the intensely vivid experience is the present, right? And this becomes the past because we were having this experience and now the vividness of that is increased. So this shifting intensity of vividness is what we experience as time and shifting timelines. Now, of course, some people say that, well, just because that becomes very vivid, it doesn't mean this timeline ends. This is still happening. Yes. So what we are speaking is innumerable concurrent timelines, right? Even if that's true, even if this is going on, that means the other one is also going on. So both are happening at the same time and both are influencing each other, right? Both are influencing each other. Isn't it true? Let's say if a person does a therapy session, regression therapy. So if I regress to 5 years old when somebody got angry with me and I relive that experience. Now, isn't it true that the present is influencing the past? Because what we call the past was simply a decreased intensity of vividness. So now the present is influencing the past. Isn't it true that we are changing the past? Because if I relive that, this person got angry with me and I can see, well, that's what they did, that's what they understood, but there was no malintent there. Then the experience of that 5-year-old is experienced differently. So now what we had called the past is changing, right? So past, present, future are all experiences of vividness. This is a suggestion to explore in your own awareness. They're experience of varying vividness. Where do you turn the spotlight of consciousness? In this broader field of the second mind, in which all time dances, swims, where is the particular spotlight of attention focused? Wherever it is focused, that is experienced as the present. And when the wide span is experienced, past, present, future, all are experienced as the present, as the undifferentiated present of the second mind. Right? Now, with this background, the question is a simple one. Is it possible to reverse time? It's not that time needs to be reversed. And I think in physics, we know now that there's no bias as far as the physics is concerned, as far as the mathematics is concerned, as to whether time moves forward or backwards, right? And that is one indication that it is simply whether you're going backwards or forwards, what we're speaking about is simply vividness of experience. And what we interpret as directionality, as past to present or present to future, is simply based upon our own assumptions and where our awareness locks in. Biologically and societally, based on the stories we tell, we're locked into particular time frames of vision, right? The mind focuses on certain kinds of events, right? Our eyes are focused forward. So we're always moving from the back to the front, for example. So our awareness is focused on certain timelines. However, everything that we have experienced is informing us now. And as we choose to re-experience certain things, that will also inform and change what we experienced as the past, as we bring that into the present through vividness and intensity of attention. So it is not that we have to reverse time. It is that time is not necessarily going forward to begin with. We are simply focused on a particular channel or a particular aspect of time in which sequences develop in a particular order, right? And that's very helpful. It's not that we should not do that. If we did not do that, we would not be functional in this society. But that's different from saying that that's the only way time works, right? And this is the thrust behind many people in spirituality say all or the present, everything is the present. There is only the present, right? Be here now. All these kinds of sayings are essentially suggesting this. Right? Daniel Jimenez says, is that the space that remote viewing comes from? So this question allows us to combine a couple of things we spoke about. We are always, in a sense, remote viewing. Right now, we are remote viewing. And I don't simply mean, well, there's two ways. One, of course, is through this technology that we've developed, right? The location of this body is in a different physical location than your body, for example. So that's a form of remote viewing through a technology. But anything you see, even if you look at the things in the room, the fundamental viewing mechanism is the exact same. There's no non-remote viewing and remote viewing. Remember what we said before, what we see, what we interpret as the first mind organ of perception, the eye, seeing an object, which is, by the way, entirely valid. We're not negating the validity of that. It is entirely valid to say that the eye is picking up the perception of an object that exists there. That's simply looking at a particular bracket of experience, the first mind experience and what it perceives and deriving logic based on that. It's entirely valid. And it's incomplete. From a more complete perspective, that very same I is an interpretation in itself of this second mind, right? Therefore, as we said, when the eyes are closed, we see, let's say, a beach, imagining a beach. When the eyes are open, the image of the beach can fade if attention shifts to this interpretation here. So both the eye and the body is itself a form of remote viewing, right? In that it is remote or distant or interpreted from this undifferentiated reality. And from that perspective, distance is not really a factor. We are interpreting our own bodies now, aren't we? And you could say that there's zero distance between us and the body, at least in the physical sense. You can't measure the distance. How can you say, where's the distance between me and my body? How far apart are we? We don't say that because physically we assume that we are the structure. And yet this body itself is interpreted. We know that. So the body itself is being interpreted by the mind. And in the very same way, whatever distance may be the case, the distance itself is an interpretation of the mind. When identity localizes in one place, then the sense of distance also appears. And then we happen to call that remote viewing, but the mechanism is the exact same. All right, so one thing to stress is the reason we're talking about this is simply to show that there are no fundamental discrepancies in the nature of consciousness and recognizing the nature of consciousness, mind, and perception and what we understand scientifically. If we understand this completely, there are no discrepancies. There's no need to throw one of these out to say that only this is right or only this is right. No. The more fully we understand this, the more seamless all of these perspectives and interpretations and views on reality are, right? So the benefit to a person, the real benefit is as the mind steadies. As the mind steadies, more and more resources become available to the individual to navigate life, become available to that identity to navigate life, right? So, not to chase after one thing. I want to see this or I want to see that. I want to develop this because then all the general problems stay the same. Now, a person has a particular ability, but all the difficulties and all the other problems are the same because it's the same underlying drive or the same underlying inability to deal with certain things that is driving the desire to gain something new. You see? So, although we talk about all of this, the purpose of this is to recognize that, wow, there really is no discrepancy among all these fields of knowledge. And then to recognize that all of these things we're talking about are simply side effects of recognizing one's own nature more deeply. And the real jewel, in my version, in my story, the real jewel is in having access to resources to navigate this lifetime. Right? There's no use being able to do this and that and still being overwhelmed in this lifetime or not having a way to express it. All right, we have some more time here. Why don't we spend just a few minutes in silence because we've talked a whole bunch today. Some very subtle concepts. So let's create space here. If the thoughts are running, let them run. Let the thoughts exhaust themselves. Thought is not going to figure out thought. This underlying awareness, rather, will begin to assemble thought according to its own intelligence. So let's create some space for that. Sink into this deeper intelligence that you are. Now, once again, feel your body as your eyes are closed. Feel the body. Note the contours of the body arising as impressions in the mind. Now, slowly allow the eyelids to open and note the contours of the room also arising in the mind. Note that the contours in the room arising are simultaneous with the sensation of the eyelids rising. These are co-events, co-representations of the second mind. And when we bracket that experience and attend to a particular band within that broader mind, then what it feels like is that this identity, which is inside the body, opened its eyes and saw a world that was already there existing, which is incompletely true. The world that is already existing is of a potential nature. Of course, don't take my word for it. This should not be a belief. This should be a possibility that each person can investigate and reject or accept. Few minutes. I don't know if we're going to get through all of this. Can we say that from the third mind configuration, there's no knower or known, but simply knowing? So the third mind is our only knowing, or does it actually happen in the second mind configuration with subject-object integration? Remember we said before that there are many degrees of subject-object integration. It's a subtle topic. We'll just say very quickly that there's the individual and there's the hand that I'm perceiving, right? Subject, object. There's the individual and there's the world out there, the room that we're perceiving, subject, object. And there's something that is often called a witness state, where the world itself is kind of an object and an awareness is the subject. So there's world, there's witness, and the witnessed, another level of subject object. And as the witness and the witnessed collapse, there's the ocean of experience, which may be called the second mind, right? And this ocean of experience, its intrinsic nature before it exists as itself in the form of waves, waves of experience. That is the third mind. Can we call that knowing? Sure, we can call it knowing. It's not really about the word, right? The second mind can also be called knowing. The third mind, there's no real word for such descriptions because all language is relative. It has to be in relation. You at least have to have an absolute and a relative to have language. Among the relative, there's language. Distinguishing the absolute and relative, there's language. But when there is neither the absolute nor the relative, there is no language. Nothing applies. So we can call it knowing, but what is most helpful is to recognize this second mind nature. And saturate in that recognition. That can be called knowing, and then we'll see what happens. Susan Williamson says, we are timeless. Yes, an aspect of us is timeless. Timelessness apparently modifies as time, which can sound very abstract, and therefore the importance of reflecting on this and experimenting with what it actually refers to. So let me read a few lines. Again, this is the book, Is This a Dream? The subtitle is Reflections on the Awakening Mind. And Deepak was kind enough to write a foreword, as you can see at the bottom. Please do leave a review on Amazon. We are on the 3 stages of meditation. We have a few minutes left. So some people say, that, am I running from the world in meditation? You know, why do some people say all of this spirituality talks about meditating and then you're not dealing with the world, you're just meditating, right? So that's kind of the early stage of meditation. So what is that about? How do we address that? So this is page 34. One way to see meditation is as a process of summoning more of yourself. You're accessing resources that you've always had hidden away in the closet. In the beginning, it can seem like you're running away from the world, but in fact, what you're doing is recharging, right? Just like you might charge your phone at night. We all do the same thing when we sleep. We're not running from the world when we sleep. We're merely going to a place that restores us and helps us bring more resources to bear on the next day. Similarly, meditation helps us bring more resources to the life we live, right? So just like you charge your phone, you charge your laptop, and we charge the body and the mind in sleep. Similarly, meditation is a way of charging that entire mind and charging the body, right? Which is why meditation and sleep come close and influence each other as meditation deepens, right? As that mind is calmer over time, it will require less sleep because it is remaining charged throughout the day. All right. So we talked about the 3 stages, right? Some ways to describe it, many ways. One is that when we first close the eyes, then many thoughts can come up, right? Whatever ideas, feelings, intuitions have not been attended to will immediately come up. And noting all of these is something like stage 1. And then stage 2 is as these eventually die down, we notice the awareness. That has always been an aspect of what we are. That has been noticing all of these thoughts running around, and that has been lost in all of these thoughts running around. So becoming aware of this silence, that, oh, there is a silence, and oh, it is accessible, it is available, and beginning to attend to that. This is stage 2. And stage 3 might then be when we move into and as the silence. This is one of the gateways in which shifts in identity and perception can occur. Where the human instrument becomes very sensitive and picks up on subtleties that were not noted when the identity was caught up in the more outer layers of perceptions and thoughts. And so we sink into ourselves. We fall unto ourselves. our own intelligence. That which stands by its own feet. Breathe fully. Experience the entire system, the entire body-mind system as the materializing of breathing. Just as you can see your breath condense on a cold day as you breathe. Experience the condensation that is your mind and body. And now, in this mind's eye, visualize the body. See the body sitting or standing or laying down as it is doing now in the mind's eye. And now allow the feeling of what we call eyelids to feel like they're moving upwards, and notice the populating of the mind field. Is this a dream? A question with no direct answer, a question to which life's experiences indicate explorations. If you have questions, please do note them in the chat, and we will take them up next week when we reach episode 20. We'll be starting the next chapter is self-awareness. Oh no, chapter 6 next week. What you are is more than who you are.